Chapter 6: The Claudian Invasion. Everything about Dio and the spurious account attributed to that name is bogus. Neither it nor he ever existed in his supposed form as a bona fide classical author. There is, as shown previously in this work, absolutely no evidence to support his authenticity, and plenty to suggest that he was a construct of the Renaissance. His forerunner, Tacitus, predated him only in the sense that he was fraudulently created in the 15th century rather than the 16th, as Dio was. Nevertheless, the purpose of this chapter is not to reiterate that which is already aforementioned. Its primary concern is with the information provided by Dio, its origin, its relevance, its problems, and how this has affected our understanding of British history since the Renaissance. Dio's incredibility and his unabashed use of Caesar and Suetonius in his disingenuous and diffident account of the Claudian invasion has already been demonstrated. However, and beyond his lazy and blatant plagiarism, there is calculated reason. The intertwinement of these eminent accounts infused his creation with credibility. Habitually ambiguous in detail, Dio relied on familiar elements from the classics to ground his fantastical account. He also happily took from his near-contemporary fabulist Tacitus. Whether the creator of Dio mimicked the fraudulence of Tacitus or believed him genuine is immaterial. He certainly knew that Tacitus was widely perceived as a genuine bridge to an unrecorded and unverifiable ancient past, and therefore provided the perceived credibility which he sought. Dio has Claudius achieving what Caesar could not. Tacitus had been too cautious as to touch upon the invasion himself, and inadvertently left the door open for Dio. Supposing himself safe from contradictory evidence, the creator of Dio looked to Caesar for provision of the brass tacks of his imagined invasion story. The illustrious general had led 3 invasions of Britain. However, he had not secured a permanent military presence. A successful invasion and military occupation of the island was a fundamental prequel to Tacitus's tall tales of occupation. Understandably, Dio's creator dived fearlessly into this undefended void of British history, cynically lifting and repeating key elements of Caesar's second invasion. From his unopposed landing and his march on the Thames, Dio simply alters the emperor and the outcome. Caesar admits in his commentaries that he could not successfully secure the river and therefore could not take Cassibelanus's capital. One of the main reasons is confirmed by the Brittonic source and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England. Caswallon, Cassibelanus, had ordered stakes of the thickness of a man's thigh to be planted along the middle of the Thames. Bede, writing centuries later, confirms that Caesar arrived at the River Thames, where an immense multitude of the enemy had posted themselves on the farthest side of the river, and fenced the bank of the river and almost all the ford under water with sharp stakes. The remains of these are to be seen to this day, fixed immovably in the bottom of the river. Unfettered by obligations to fact, Dio's objective was to have Claudius achieving what Caesar could not. By simple supplementation, he has Claudius successfully crossing the Thames, defeating the natives, and capturing the king's capital. For good measure, he embellishes his rendition with exotic animals and remarkably expeditious travel across Europe. He claims that the Britons withdrew to the Thames. Plautius became afraid to advance any further, and sent for Claudius as instructed. A good deal of equipment, including elephants, were assembled. When the report reached Claudius in Rome, he travelled partly overland and partly along the rivers. He crossed over to Britain and joined the army. Taking over command, he crossed the river and, engaging the natives, defeated them and took Camulodunum, the capital of Cunobelinus. He disarmed the Britons and handed them over to Plautius. Claudius himself hastened back to Rome. According to Caesar's commentaries and the Brittonic source, capturing Cassibelanus's capital was the clear objective of Caesar's second invasion. Caesar had recognized Cassibelanus's extraordinary status as commander-in-chief and the location of his capital north of the Thames. He wrote that, by common consent, had supreme command and conduct of the war been vested in Cassibelanus, whose territory was separated from the coastal tribes by a river called the Thames. The Brittonic source confirms this and reveals that Cassibelanus had separated himself from the traditional capital of London in explicit acknowledgement of his nephew Afawi. Caesar refers to Afarwi as Mandubratius, however, and nonetheless, he was the eldest son of King Lud, whom Cassibelanus had succeeded. Afarwi was evidently recognized as the heir apparent and sat in his late father's capital under the title Prince of London. Following the significant domestic dispute, which ultimately saw Britain become tributary to Rome, Cunobelinus pledged to Caesar and the abdication of the heir apparent Afarwi. Lud's younger son, Tenephan, succeeded Cassibelanus. With the nuances of Cassibelanus's regency now obsolete, so was his pre-existing provincial command centre north of the Thames. It was no longer warranted nor wanted. Ruling in Afarwi's absence, Tenephan sat in the lineal capital of London, as his father had done. Likewise, his successor and hitherto hostage nephew, Cunobelinus, wielded the sceptre from London on his return from Rome. By 43 AD, the temporary headquarters of Cassibelanus, from which he had evidently conducted Britain's defence against Caesar, had been defunct for almost a century. Its purpose, north of the Thames and separate from the ancestral capital of London, had long ceased. Unlike Caesar during his second invasion, Claudius had no objective north of the Thames, nor a need to cross it. The derelict headquarters of Cassibelanus served only as an unpleasant reminder to Cunobelinus of his negotiated captivity, his country's capitulation to tribute, and his father's abdication and death in exile. The suggestion that Cassibelanus' miserable provisional capital was maintained beyond his death is nonsensical. Moreover, the idea that it somehow superseded London, which Afarwi had sacrificed so much for, is farcical. Dio's ignorant plagiarism of Caesar's second invasion categorically misunderstands its inherent objective north of the Thames and its incompatibility with Claudius's own objective a century later. Richard Hingley reminds us that London's pre-Roman capital status was only first challenged during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I by John Stow. Stow put far better credit in Caesar's account than that of the Brittonic source. Stow did, however, subscribe to the lineage of Lud, found in the Brittonic source, but was overwhelmingly beguiled by the relatively recent revelations of Tacitus. The commissioned humanist author of the Anglica Historia, Polydore Virgil, shared papal allegiance with the professed discoverer of Tacitus, Poggio Bracciolini. He appeared unable to look beyond his contemporary's dubious discovery when assessing London's historic capital status. Hingley confirms that an academic fixation denying London's past has persisted. Traditionalists' incredible attachment to Dio has stymied debate on the subject, despite growing archaeological finds to the contrary. Besides the impractical and incredible impression presented by Dio and his anachronistic inclusion of an obsolete objective north of the Thames, his ill-judged injection of snippets from others exposes his farce further. The first two arrive in the form of Cunobelinus and Plautius, which are clearly lifted from Suetonius. The third and most remarkable, however, is Camulodunum. It has stuck so immovably to the traditionalist narrative of the Claudian invasion that its origin, purpose, and incredibility necessitates examination and explanation. Camulodunum. Initially imagined by Tacitus but unrecognizably enhanced and incited by Dio, Camulodunum has been disseminated by all who have ignorantly credited its spurious creation. A suffocating amount of archaeological appropriation and conceited conjecture has grown from this founding falsehood. Nauseatingly, the myth of Camulodunum has miraculously manifested into the foundations of British history, despite being utterly bogus. The name Camulodunum first enters the fabulists' fray late on in the 15th century via Tacitus. According to his annals, the governor, Publius Ostorius, sought to hold in check the whole area between the rivers Trisantona, Trent, and Sabrina, Severn, and established a colony with a strong core of veterans on captured land at Camulodunum. Then an advance was made against the Sialures. Dio, never knowingly allowing truth to impinge on a good story, appropriated the spurious town to enhance the credibility of his own report. Unfazed that Tacitus placed his Camulodunum in the West Midlands, supposedly to support an advance into South Wales, Dio nonchalantly relocates it to immediately north of the Thames, well over 100 miles away. Equally unabashed with specifics, traditionalists pushed it even further east, settling it 150 miles away in Colchester. Whether Camalodunum was intended to be in Colchester, Westminster, or Kidderminster is totally immaterial. The propagandism of Tacitus and Dio, from which the farce arose, was concerned less with truth or geographical accuracy than recovering the Roman Church's monopoly on Christian doctrine. Dio intentionally inserted Camulodunum because it gave a semblance of credibility to his pseudo-classical account. Although it is Tacitus who introduces Camulodunum into the narrative of Roman Britain, it is Dio who removes it from between the Severn and the Trent and imagines it by the Thames. Moreover, it is Dio who embellishes the fiction further, claiming his Camulodunum to be the capital of Cunobelinus. The explanation for the patent disparity in location is simple. Both accounts are utterly spurious. Nevertheless, understanding the origin of the name and the credibility Dio believed it transmitted to his own account is crucial. Indeed, once the name of Camulodunum entered the humanist's nebulous narrative, through the ridiculous revelations of Tacitus, it quickly became inviolate and incontrovertible. Dio's enthusiastic transformation, relocation, and elevation of Camulodunum created the linchpin from which British history has seemingly hung since. It is no coincidence that Dio's revelations materialized in 1548. The accession of England's first Protestant king, Edward VI, in 1547, crystallized the direction of the country. Even though it relapsed bloodily under the reign of his half-sister Mary, the direction of change ultimately fixed upon the reformed route. The date of Dio's dubious disclosure in 1548 is crucial to the consideration of evidence which purportedly corroborates his Camulodunum. The key documents which traditionalists claim to support his spurious Roman settlement are the Antonine Itinerary and the Peutinger Table. The former provides hundreds of routes, distances, and locations across the Roman Empire. The latter is essentially a map equivalent. Within the Antonine Itinerary, the lists of routes in Britain are commonly referred to as Iter Britanniarum and are conspicuously separate from the rest of the itinerary. Furthermore, and since Dio's 1548 publication, the Iter Britanniarum has trebled in size through the anachronistic addition of localities. The first record of the Iter Britanniarum comes by way of Robert Talbot during the reign of Henry VIII. Considered one of England's earliest antiquaries, Talbot's memoir in Athenae Oxonienses reports on his Annotationes in eam partem itinerari Antonini quae ad Britannium, which the learned Camden in his Britannia, and Will Burton in his commentary on Antonius, his itinerary, and others did much use. Remarkably, only 3 of the Iter Britanniarum he annotated were extant by 1691 and were retained in obscure places, one in the library of Benet College in Cambridge, another in that of Sir John Cotton at Westminster, and a third in Bodleius Vatican. Although evidently revered and authoritative, these earliest known Iter Britanniarum endeth at the word Luguval at the end of the 5th itinerary and goeth no further. The first 5 Iters provide a coherent map of routes from the north of the island to the south, avoiding mountain ranges. Iter 1, for example, proceeds from High Rochester to Catterick on the eastern side of the Pennines, passes through York and terminates on the coast at Bridlington. Iter 2 proceeds from Carlisle to Catterick, down the western side, passes through York and heads southwest to Wroxeter, and then southeast to London and terminates at Richborough. The routes are logical, relatively straight, and terminate at ports. Moreover, distances to London are represented in all but the route which circumnavigates the Pennines to the east. Dio's imagined Camulodunum simply does not feature in the original. It slithered into the Iter Britanniarum, post-Protestantism, after the fabulist's fallacy had set its insidious roots. The Iter Britanniarum suffered unreasonable enlargement through conjecture and ignorant inclusion. A.L.F. Rivet and Kenneth Jackson admit that the British section of the Antonine Itinerary relied on the edition of Okunz, Leipzig, 1929. This, in turn, depended upon manuscripts that are presumed to have existed but are now lost. Kuntz himself cites only 2 extant manuscripts, neither of which include the British section. Rivet and Jackson justify their negligent reliance on these speculative sources because, they claim, corroborative information is found in the Peutinger Table. However, the table is an unverifiable copy of a supposed copy, and therefore no more reliable than the inflated Iter Britanniarum. The Tabula Peutingeriana was first published on the eve of the 17th century. It allegedly originated a century earlier with the unscrupulous Renaissance manuscript hunter Conradus Celtis. Its advocates claim it to be a copy of a Roman map which Celtis gifted to Conrad Poetinger of Augsburg. However, the unrecorded and unverifiable document remained unknown and unpublished until 1598. Arriving half a century after Dio's dubious disclosure, Mark Vesler's supposed copy of Celtis's copy consisted of 8 sheets, used exclusive symbols, showed no blemishes, and provided the first representation of Camulodunum. Another example appeared during the 18th century, when Celtis's supposed original copy miraculously resurfaced. However, and unlike Velser's immaculate copy from 1598, the much later copy boasted 4 additional sections. Despite this, the title page, on which the author's name and the map of Britain was apparently represented, was badly disfigured. Moreover, it provided no information on Britain additional to that in Vesler's Editio Princeps. However, Christoph von Scheib's drawn facsimile of 1753 is naively preferred by traditionalists because all the blemishes were shown with great care. Remarkably, this adept artistry alone has seemingly shrouded the table's incredible creation long after Dio's Camulodunum claim.